Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we're going to go ahead and tackle the question niche versus designer. What is a niche fragrance, what is a designer fragrance, and how it kind of all fits in together. I released a video earlier, actually a week or two back, basically where I asked the question, hey, what is a niche fragrance and what is a designer fragrance? The question came to mind because as I was kind of thinking, and this has been on my mind for a long time now, so as I was thinking to myself, well, what is a niche fragrance and what is a designer fragrance? After all, I never got the definition from anyone specifically, and looking around, nobody has ever really, espoused what a niche fragrance is and what a designer fragrance is, but everyone has had their own interpretations of what these fragrances are. So I really encourage you to view that video, and it'll be posted somewhere here or there, and see what people's definitions are. And the one major takeaway that is absolutely fascinating is that almost everyone has a different meaning of what niche is. So a lot of them are very similar, but a lot of them are different as well. I mean, the most of them are different as well too. So what I mean by that, there's small little caveats, and it even further goes to play once you start, actually putting across fragrances and asking people to classify them as a niche or designer fragrance. Now, I've largely stayed away from this question because of the fact that, to me, whether or not the fragrance is niche or designer really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter if the fragrance is niche or designer. It's like, okay, I think Eau de Beau is a niche fragrance. No, I think Eau de Beau is a designer fragrance. And then it's like, okay, it's a niche fragrance. Now what? It's a niche fragrance. So what? You know that you classified it as niche. You didn't take anything else from it. And so I've always thought the argument of whether fragrances were designer or niche was one of the most retarded arguments that ever existed. I'm sorry for offending anyone with special needs. I've got a curtailment, but I have always thought that it was a stupid argument because it didn't really result in anything, and all it did was cause friction, and it didn't advance anything basically. And so that's why I've always steered away from it. But I'm always curious, just for, I guess you could say, for clarity's sake, what it is. So I'm gonna go ahead and first start off with what the actual definitions of designer and niche are, and then start applying them, show you what, I guess you could say, what my definition always has been, and kind of go on from there. So let's start off with the definition of niche fragrances. Let's start off with designer first. So the definition of a designer fragrance is, or sorry, not designer fragrance, but designer, is made or having the expensive sophistication of a famous or prestigious fashion designer, or upscale and fashionable. Right? Those are the two definitions. For niche, the definitions are a comfortable or suitable position in life or employment, a specialized but profitable corner of the market, and a position or role taken by a kind of organism within its community. Such a position may be occupied by different organisms in different localities, e.g. antelopes in Africa and kangaroos in Australia. All right. And the verb form is place or position something in a niche, basically. All right, so with that, so those are the definitions for it. So as you can see, off the bat, they sort of apply to fragrance. They don't really apply to it, but they've been kind of taken and applied to fragrances. And for designer, the general position for designer fragrances is that they're supposed to be fragrances that are released by designer houses or I should use my words, or of famous clothing designers, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So that is basically what quote-unquote designers are, whereas niche fragrances are supposed to be more of a niche, or niche, basically. So now I should also preface something else, and that is, I say niche, you can say niche as well. Niche is actually, I believe, the actual dictionary pronunciation that is given, but niche I've heard used overseas, etc. So I use them interchangeably. So don't throw a hernia if you hear it pronounced like that, which I know some of you will. But either way, niche, all right, whatever. So with that, niche fragrances. Let's even take it back a little bit. Niche in general, or niche in general, is just, you would consider the hobby, or I would consider the hobby of collecting fragrances itself a niche hobby, right? By that I mean there are plenty of other hobbies that are far more, popular, far more popular. This is a relatively, small group of people who really enjoy and love fragrances, collect fragrances, talk about fragrances, go to fragrance conferences, go to fragrance gatherings, you name it, fragrance, basically, right? And so, but there's a small group of people that it holds, basically. Whereas I wouldn't consider something like video gaming or online gaming, a niche hobby. It's not. As far as, the number of people that participate in are just far greater than something that you would see in something like fragrances. But moving on to fragrances themselves, my definition when it started out used to be that designer fragrances were fragrances that were more affordable. The fragrances that were between, up to like $90, $100. And niche fragrances were the more expensive fragrances. And that's it, simply. That's what my definition was. And for large in part, it really fit just because a lot of the more expensive fragrances were the fragrances that even people who like fragrances would not go for, basically because they were so expensive. And thus they have their own niche, basically. They were the niche of expensive fragrances and the niche of affordable fragrances. But then looking at it, I realized that, this doesn't really fit because I've had this hobby for a while now. And as my income grew, so did, the range of fragrances that I could buy. I remember my very first niche fragrance that I purchased was Musc Ravageur. Musc Ravageur, I purchased that one by saving up all the change, basically, that I would get, from the store every day. And I ended up using it to buy Musc Ravageur. And niche fragrances, or the more expensive fragrances, in my mind, were the ones that, I would purchase maybe once every 2 months, one fragrance every 2 or 3 months. Now I can afford multiple niche a month, basically. It doesn't matter, and I realized that, my version of what was expensive and what was not expensive was shifting as my career became a little bit more established, basically. And so I realized, well, if that's the case, I don't really think my definition really fits. And then so I began looking into it, okay, and I started talking to some other people and figuring, all right, well, maybe it's by house. Niche houses and designer houses. And I noticed that's what a lot of people go across and say. But then I began to think in my head, okay, and that worked for me for a while, but then I had started coming across fragrances like, let's say, Guerlain. Guerlain's a good one. Guerlain has a lot of high-end fragrances that a lot of people have never heard of, and yet they have another type of line that are more affordable fragrances in the $50, $60 range and are a little bit more well-known. Habit Rouge. You've got, Guerlain's Vetiver. You've got, other Guerlain fragrances that are more in line with that. And then I began to think, well, is Guerlain a niche house or is it a designer house? I mean, they're one of the oldest fragrance houses that are out there. And so if you're going to classify, niche as being a niche house, then it just doesn't really fit to me. So the definition, I guess you could say, that I finally came up with of what I consider designer and what I consider niche, it's kind of like a conglomerate of all of them. And some people have that response as well in the other video. Again, I encourage you, read their responses, come up with your take. But either way, I came up with a conglomeration. It has to do with price, the house, availability, among many things. And those really are the three main things, with a couple other little factors here and there, but those really are the three main things. So I actually look at the fragrance, not the actual house itself. So that allows me to kind of reconcile the fact with Guerlain, I consider that they have designer fragrances and they have some niche fragrances. With the House of By Kilian, I consider them largely, by most of the fragrances, niche fragrances. Whereas something like Creed, I would almost start considering some of the other Creeds starting to get a little bit more for the designer side. But the vast majority of Creeds I would consider niche side. So I guess you could say my definition almost includes a bit of flexibility so that a house can produce both designer fragrances and niche fragrances. Whereas designer in my mind is really something that A, is affordable, it's a little bit more quote-unquote upscale, so it's not necessarily going to be your Axe fragrances or anything like that, but it's going to be something that's put out to appeal, I guess you could say, to the mainstream, if you will. Whereas niche fragrances, on top of that, they're a little bit more artistic. They tend to be more expensive, though there can be cheap niche fragrances. And that's pretty much about it. So I kind of go around. So I really want to emphasize, I really don't think people should stress the definition between niche and the definition between designer, because I, again, think it's a useless argument that serves no purpose whatsoever except for classification, except for getting people at each other's throats. It just doesn't do it for me. All right? So if you have any questions, again, I'm always curious what your thoughts are, what your definitions are. Please feel free, let me know down in the comments below. I won't hold it against you. This is just my definition. There really is none that is official or anything like that. All right? So thank you. Take care of yourselves and have a great day.